that there really is a lot of craziness. And traditionally, the Muslims have really kind of seen every single book I've ever seen, whether it's from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, they say, well, all the signs are there, the end is nigh. The idea being, in reality, the end of time is the end of our lives. I mean, that is the ultimate end of time, that we will die. And so that is an end of time. But there is also an end of human time. And so within the tradition, I think the most definitive hadith about it, which I think is also the most wonderful, is that the Prophet Muhammad said, if the end of time comes upon you and you're planting a tree, then finish planting it. In other words, don't become millenarians. Don't become people that run off and just, the end is hit. No, do what you're doing. Keep working. Keep doing it. If it happens, and you happen to be there when it happens. But don't let that stop you from action. So there is an idea of, yes, there is an end of time. There are signs. Now, in the tradition here, the first thing he asks him about the end of time, he says, tell me about the sa'a, the hour. And he says, the one being questioned doesn't know any more than the one questioning. In other words, I don't know. And he says, well, then tell me about its signs. And then the Prophet says, peace be upon him, the slave girl will give birth to her mistress. Now, that's an interesting statement. The slave girl will give birth to her mistress. And the scholars traditionally dealt with that in a lot of different ways. One of them is they said, at the end of time, slaves who in the Islamic, like for instance the Mamalik, became rulers. And many of the scholars said this is it. The Mamalik were slaves in Egypt and they actually became rulers. They said here they are. They'd become the masters. Another interpretation was that children would treat their parents like, this is a traditional interpretation, that children would treat their parents like servants. They would order them around. They would tell them what to do. That there would be a loss of respect in that relationship. But I think probably the deepest interpretation is that there would be a radical disequilibrium in social structures. When you look at the relationship between a servant and a mistress, the relationship is like a mother and a daughter. The mother is to be obeyed, nurturing the daughter obeys the mother. When that is turned upside down, then you have a radical disruption in the social order. If you look in the Quranic narrative, the first and foremost expression of a Tawhidic worldview, of a belief in one God, is ihsan to the parents, beauty to the parents, showing beauty to the parents. The Quran says, and God has told the human being to honor his parents. The mother first, it says, Ummuhu hamalathu wahnan ala wahn. The mother nurtured and gave birth to the child, sapped and weakened. Right? So the 9 months of nurturing a child in the womb, giving birth, suckling the child, raising the child, changing the child, doing all of these things, that there is a great debt owed. The child to the parent, particularly the mother. And this is why the Prophet said that the paradise is at the feet of the mothers. It's literally at the feet of the mothers. And the Prophet was once asked, who is the most worthy of my companionship? And the Prophet answered, your mother. And then he said, and then who? He said, your mother. And he said, and then who? He said, your mother. And he said, and then who? He said, your father. And then in another tradition, a man came to him and he said, Ya Rasulullah, O Messenger of God, I am cleaning my mother in her decrepit age the way she used to clean me. Is that filial piety? And he said, no, that's payback. He literally said that's recompense, right? You're just, recompensing what she did for you. So the disruption of the parental-child relationship is a deep disruption within a social order. And we can see that really, I think, not simply in our own societies, but it's becoming quite a global phenomenon. the idea of rebellion. There is an idea in our culture certainly that it's a given that children will rebel. Right? This does not happen. Suleiman Yang, who's from the Wolof culture, right? I mean, in the Wolof, is there any idea of that? Of a adolescent rebellion against the parents? I'm just curious. There might be. Do you have any idea in your culture of like adolescent rebellion against the parents?
Well, I mean, the way they are socialized, they have the age-grade set. So it's beginning to happen because of westernization, but it was not there.
It was not there. That would be consistent with my experience in Mauritania, that they really had no concept of children rebelling against the parents. Whereas it is becoming a norm, and with westernization it's increasing because of the idea of rebel without a cause. That there is this idea that children have to rebel, that they have to establish their identities. There's an awful lot of identity foreclosure in the Ericksonian type of model, I think, in the Muslim world. There is an idea that you really have to do what your parents say. And I think there's a lot of abuse that happens from the parents to the children, because they do have an upper hand there. So you do see that. A child will become an engineer because that's what the parents say that they should be. Right? Which, in our culture, I think that's, in a sense, one of the positive aspects of our culture, is that there is a type of freedom that is allowed for a young person in many, many families. I mean, it's certainly not true across the board, but there are many families that do allow a child to experiment and try to find out. And I think that's actually a very positive aspect of our society and civilization. But the idea of the breakdown of the social structure is something that is definitely part of the end of time, that we move into a disequilibrium. If you look, there's a wonderful book on this topic written by a French scholar and intellectual called René Guénon, which is called The Reign of Quantity. And in that book, he talks about the idea of moving away from a quality-based culture into a quantity-based culture. And he considers that what the Hindus call the Kali Yuga period, the last period of man on earth, that it would be a period of great disruption and turmoil, that there would be a massive upheaval of traditional models and a radical new type of way of looking at the world, which is related more to quantity than quality. And it's interesting, there's the idea, one of the things that we as a Western people have done, which is quite unique and a radical departure from traditional cultures, is the quantification of everything. We've really set out to measure everything. Measure space, measure gas, measure air, measure the speed of light. All of these things wanting to measure, to quantify. And I thought it was very interesting I had statistics in college, and one of the professors who taught the course said at the beginning of the course, one of the things about statistics that you'll learn is it doesn't work very well with qualitative data. It works very well with quantitative data. But when you get into this qualitative data, we have problems. Right? And I thought that was kind of interesting, because so much of our society is based on statistics. We really do base a good percentage of our policies, of even in school and education. So much is based on, well, what are the stats here? Before we give you money, show us some stats. And immediately when you move into that model, you're moving into a quantitative and not a qualitative model, generally. So, now to go into some of the signs. There are basically, the scholars have identified 3 types of signs. Signs that have already occurred, signs that have occurred and continue to intensify. And then signs that haven't occurred. So some of the signs that have already occurred according to the Muslims are signs like the birth of the Prophet. That was a sign, according to the Prophet. The Prophet also said that the death of Umar was a sign, and the death of Uthman. He said that the fall of Constantinople, which occurred 800 years after the hadith was recorded, he said the fall of Constantinople was a sign. He said the fall of Rome also to the Muslims, that the city of Rome would become Muslim, which hasn't happened yet. Right? The Pope, and also, so that would be a later sign that haven't occurred. But in terms of already occurred, they would be signs that have happened. There was a fire that the Prophet predicted in Medina, which was a result of a volcano that erupted. And he said that Medina would be confronted with a massive fire. And that occurred. And several other events that are mentioned in the tradition. The signs that have occurred and continue to intensify. One of them that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that one of the signs would be that intoxicants would be widely used. So you can see this happening in the Muslim world and just intensifying from quite some time ago. Another sign would be nakedness, that people would begin to remove their clothes. And he said until it would get to the point where people would actually walk around in the marketplaces in shorts with their thighs fully exposed. Right? It's in a hadith, al-mashu fil aswaq wal afkhadu badiyatun, walking in marketplaces with the thighs fully exposed. He said also that people would have sexual intercourse in front of other people was a sign of the end of time. He said that it would get so bad that you would see people fornicating in public places, and the best people would be people who would say, "Can't you do that somewhere else?" Another one would be speed in travel. He said great distances would be traversed in very short times. And he said also that people would hop between the clouds and the earth. Al-qafsu bayn al-ardi wa sama. And he said that there would be musical instruments would be everywhere. And he said that also that people would dance with instruments on their head, which some have interpreted as headphones. That they would dance with instruments on their head, and they would spend the whole night dancing like that. And he also said that you would see singing women prevalent in public spaces. Because traditionally that was something that people did in private things, but he said it would become out open into the public. And he said that there would be many people he said takthur al-hawsat, which would be whisperings, like there would be many confused people that would have a lot of psychological type of problems. So, I mean, I could go on and on, it gets quite depressing. So, those are signs. Now then there's the big ones. In which the Prophet, the biggest of all, is called the Antichrist, which people understand. Hadith literature. The vast majority of the signs of the end of time are related to hadith literature, although some are in the Quran. One of them is that a clear smoke would appear over cities towards the end of time. It's in Surah Al-Dukhan. Some people have interpreted as that. Yeah, dukhan is smoke, gas. It's the same word used for gas in Arabic. Dukhan is used for gas as well, because the Arabs didn't. Ghaz is a modern word for the Arabs. Dukhan was used for gas as well.
Could clear mean like transparent?
No, clear mean it would be everybody would see it.
Oh, I see.
Right? And it says from the evil that people were doing. Another a major sign is the Dajjal. Now I just want to read because I think it's very interesting. This was written in the last century, but it's taken out of classical Arabic books.
Is this the Antichrist?
Yeah, this is about the Antichrist. The word in Arabic is from Dajjala. It means to smear a camel with tar. In other words, covering the whole body with tar. Smearing the part that is mangy or scaby. So it has the idea of hiding illness or sickness, covering it over, right? Covering it over with a black pitch. To lie, to to conceal truth with falsehood, concealing the truth. He enchanted or fascinated. So the idea that the Antichrist is an enchanter or a fascinator. People are fascinated by him. He compressed, he traversed the regions or tracts of the earth or land. Now, the Prophet said that the Dajjal would enter every city on the planet. When they asked him what would his speed be like, he said like a wind that leaves a cloud in its trail. كَرِيحٍ اسْتَدْبَرَتْهُ السَّحَابِ literally means like a wind that leads a cloud in its trail. And in another tradition, he said he would ride a white donkey made of iron, whose span between his two ears was 40 cubits. Baghlatun min hadid, as the hadith says. And then he says, to confuse, to mix things, having one eye. The Prophet Muhammad... Did you have a question?
How do you spell this? What's this word
Dajjal.
Dajjal.
Dajjal is the word in Arabic for Antichrist, which is better translated by the Arabs in the Arabic language as the impostor Christ.
Christ is used, huh?
Oh, Christ, yeah, Masih ad-Dajjal, the false Messiah. Very much so.
In Islam, the concept of the Messiah is a one-time thing represented by Jesus of Nazareth. Or
Jesus is seen as the Messiah.
the Messiah. So this is an
This is going to be anti-Jesus. Yes.
Okay.
And it's interesting because if you study the Islamic Jesus, I think it gives you a very good picture of the idea of an anti-Jesus. Because anti in Greek, antis also means in place of, instead of. It doesn't really mean against. The original meaning of anti in Greek as a prefix means instead of. And that's closer to the Arabic interpretation, which is impostor or in place of, pretending to be. The Islamic Jesus, and I actually translate, I'm hoping to get it out this year, but I translate all of the Arabic sayings of Jesus, because there's actually more sayings in the Islamic tradition of Jesus than there are in the New Testament. And most of them deal with the dangers of the world, of materialism. So I find it really interesting that, this idea of an imposter, that Jesus is, the whole thrust of the Islamic Jesus is salvation through giving up material wants. And the idea of an antichrist is salvation through desire of material goods. That it is material goods that will make you happy. That is material goods that will save you. So I think there's a very materialistic element in here. And also the idea of being one-eyed is that part of binocular vision is depth perception, which you lose with one eye. And so the idea that that the Dajjal or the Antichrist does not have a depth perception. He's a two-dimensional being. He sees things in two dimensions. And some of the Muslim scholars do not consider it an individual, but most do. And some, and you'll see it as we go on here. Having one eye is one of them. Also to gild a thing. So in other words, you take lead, you put gold over it. That's Dajjal. So to make something that's cheap or insignificant look very worthwhile or significant. Cover the land with water. He put his land into a right or proper state, prepared it, improved it with dung. So to spread dung on the earth. To spread feces on the earth. Dajjal, dung for manuring land. And then Dajjal is refuse, lowest, basest, or meanest sort of people. The lowest, basest, or meanest sort of people. Dajjal, a gilder, a liar, conceals truth with falsehood, who deceives, deludes, beguiles, circumvents, outwits, much or often, very deceitful, the great deceiver. And then a great company of men, Dajjala in Arabic means a great company of men journeying together, covering the ground by their multitude, or a company of men journeying together, carrying goods for sale. Right, so trafficking goods all over the place. Masih al-Kadhab, the false Christ or Antichrist, is to be a certain man. Right? Comes forth in the last days. So having one eye or eyebrow. So you get the idea there. This is classical, coming out of classical dictionaries. The idea of the Antichrist is that towards the end there will be a type of false salvation through love of the world and material things and these things. And I think the Muslims definitely have a very strong sense of the Dajjal, because at the end of the prayer, you actually make a prayer that says, and I seek refuge from the tribulation of the Dajjal in the last period. And the Prophet Muhammad said, every prophet has warned his people about the Dajjal, but I will tell you something that no other prophet told his people. He only has one eye. So that was the tradition that he said about the Dajjal, that he would have one eye. And there's a very interesting, some of the Muslims said, the television is like a Dajjal, it's a one-eyed type beast. And there's an interesting section in Lewis Mumford's, the second volume of his work on the Mega Machine, which is the one eye of Re, the all-seeing eye of Re. And he talks about that the Mega Machine, one of the things about the Mega Machine, he said traditionally, was that they didn't have an all-seeing power, these previous kings and rulers. And so he said what's happening though is that, and he wrote this in 1961, he said, in the near future, we have theoretically at our hands a machine that will able to monitor all of our life, which is the computer. And he said that, and this is what Foucault called the panoptic society, the all-seeing society. And it was designed after the idea of a prison system that Jeremy Bentham designed, which was where you had a center piece, utilitarianism. You had this center, you only needed one guard. And around the guard were all the prison cells. So in the middle was a tower at which this one guard could watch everything at one time. And so the idea of the all-seeing, the state apparatus in which we're all monitored. A really interesting book about this subject is called I can see the cover because it's got that pyramid with the eye on it. It's The Naked Consumer. Very interesting book about how we're watched. A lot of people don't know this, but when you buy things with your credit cards, they go under biodatas, and so they can work out. Like I started getting all this stuff about like different types of books. I'd get these like things from spiritual book companies and things, because they worked out, you buy them and then they sell, they do biodata on you, find out what type of books you like to read, and then they sell that list to people. When we had a baby, the first child, then like a week later we got all these things about, and my wife was like, wow, what, this is a classic problem with religion, right? It's a sign, right? No. There's somebody that monitors for the corporations all the births in the county, and they sell your address to people, right? It wasn't a sign, right? Or it was a sign that we're in big trouble, right? Where everything's being watched by these. So the idea just of, this kind of panoptic culture where, and the interesting thing now is this idea of computers with the actual camera on it. Very interesting phenomenon, because who else can watch, right? Who else can watch while you're having your conversations and things like that? So there is an idea of this, the Antichrist and the end. And most Muslims do believe in a second coming of Jesus. Vast majority of Muslims. There are many hadiths that confirm it's not actually mentioned directly in the Quran, but most Muslims do believe in a second coming of Christ towards the end of time. Mm-hmm.
Well, wouldn't that sort of like mean that Muhammad wasn't still in the process of Jesus?
Good point. And that was something that the scholars did deal with. He will not come back as a prophet bringing a Sharia. According to the Muslims, he actually comes back and he confirms the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. That's how the Muslims view it. That he comes back. The question was, wouldn't that mean that the Prophet Muhammad wasn't the seal? But it would, in the sense that the Prophet is after Jesus. The Prophet Muhammad said, there's no prophet between me and Jesus. And he said, that all of the prophets are brothers. We have the same father, which is the religion of the deen of Islam, with different mothers, meaning the different sharias or the different sacred laws. And then the next after the birth of mistress is that you will see the barefooted, naked, destitute herdsmen competing in constructing lofty buildings. Now at one level this is seen by many people in the modern time, the idea of, the Bedouin people now in the Arabian Peninsula building all these, they were literally destitute people 40, 50 years ago. And when I was in the United Arab Emirates, I was once in the Majlis of Shaykh Sultan Al-Qasimi, who's the ruler of Sharjah. And, they're very kind of pompous majlis. There's a lot of protocol and things. But there was this guy that came in literally in almost rags. And he came in dirty and he barefoot, comes walking in quite arrogantly, goes up to the ruler, shakes his hand, then sits down. And I asked the person next to me, who's that? And he said it's his cousin. But he's still like a Bedouin out in the... He lives out in the... And it was just, it was a Bedouin guy, lives in a tent. But, his cousin had become the ruler of the country. So I thought that was really interesting, this idea of these, poor people. And then building, a very interesting phenomenon in Arabia is building buildings and then another sheikh getting upset because so-and-so built a taller building than him. He'll actually tear down his building and build up one taller than the second one. Right? And this is also in our own culture. The New York, the Empire State Building was the tallest, and then the Chicago building one up them, and then the World Trade Center. And then you have now in Malaysia, interestingly enough, very proud. The Malaysians are very proud that they now have the tallest building in the world. And, somebody had it on the cover of a Muslim magazine and they asked me what I thought. And I said, I think it's really interesting that the Muslims are proud of being part of fulfilling the signs of the end of time, right? Because it's seen as a very negative thing, not a positive thing. And then also, there's another way to look at this, of building tall buildings, like these kind of wretched people, and that is the idea of building lofty ideas and building ideological structures, because the Quran talks about the building of taqwa, bunyan of taqwa, right? The building of God consciousness and awareness. So the idea also of wretched people creating lofty ideologies that many people will follow and think that they're the truth and things like that. So these is just a very quick overview about it. And then also finally, I think the point of all of that is that time does come to an end, that the human condition does come to an end, and that's how Islam contextualizes history, is that there is an end that is imminent. Again, I think for the individual person, the imminence of the end of time is always related to their own personal death. But there is an idea also. And then there's another important, I think a very important idea within the Islamic tradition, and that is that each generation will be less, they will be fulfilling the idea of this dimensional Islam, of Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. They will not do it as well as the previous generation. That there is an idea that each generation is a watered down version. There are periods of renewal historically, and the Prophet Muhammad did say that there would be renewers every 100 years or so. There would be people that come and renew. But the idea that it's not the same. I mean, I think the Muslims do have an idea, traditional Muslims anyway, that it's not so much progress, but quite the opposite. One of the things René Guénon pointed out about the rapid speed of progress, he said one of the things that we forget is increasing acceleration means going down, not up, right? That the idea of the modern world, and I think there's a lot of questioning now of the wisdom of the idea. Bacon introduced the idea of progress, because prior to that the Christians did not have that idea within their worldview of that we are progressing. They had quite a different idea. And I think ultimately from the Muslim worldview and also from other traditional worldviews, that the same ethical issues that Plato is positing through Socrates. What is justice? How do we lead a good life? What is a good life? These things we have not come any closer, right, to really, progressing in terms of our ethical nature, in terms of our spiritual nature. That although we have massive outward technology, able to do extraordinary things, bring the living back, bring the dead back to life, move mountains, quite literally. Despite that, we are still dealing with basic human tendencies such as greed, lust, envy, slothfulness. It's hard to get away from those. And in some ways, we're less aware of our own negative tendencies than perhaps peoples before us were, and more filled with our own sense of hubris and our own sense of power. Although certainly the 20th century is a century that has created a lot of disillusionment. We've killed 180 million people this century alone in wars between human beings. And it's interesting that they weren't religious wars. They were ideological wars, because one of the oftentimes critics of religion will point out, well, look how many people died in the name of religion. Well, look how many people died in the name of communism, right? I mean, we forget that we're dealing with a human species, that it's not, religion is not the problem, man is the problem. Right? And if there's a humanizing factor in the human condition, as far as I'm concerned, it has been religion. That religion is what has introduced into the human being concepts like making beauty, concepts like becoming conscientious, charity, right? Caritas, these things, the kairos, all of these things are coming out of religious traditions. And the Muslims always say in the end, God knows best.